Omar Khadr, the convicted and unrepentant al-Qaeda terrorist guilty of, among other things, murdering U.S. medic Christopher Speer, was granted bail. And tomorrow, the federal government will bring an emergency motion before the Alberta Court of Appeal to stop his release, such that he's not free to roam the streets. There are a number of legal implications. I've got Ed Prutschi here with me to talk about this. Before we get into the likelihood of the success of the federal government's emergency motion, let's go back. How was it that Omar Khadr was ultimately granted bail here?
So bizarre. I mean, we have to rewind it quite a bit because initially what we're talking about is Omar Khadr had been denying his involvement for many, many years, had been fighting it in the U.S. before the courts there, and by all intents it appeared as if he was going to be going to trial. At the last minute, there was a deal put in place. He had agreed to making admissions to certain charges, including the murder, as you spoke of. There was a plea deal that arranged that he would have an 8-year sentence. He would serve that sentence in Canada, knowing full well that from a bail and parole perspective, certainly from a parole perspective, he would get released sooner as a Canadian serving a U.S. sentence here at home. Mm-hmm. And that was all arranged and agreed to as part of the plan.
Right.
So it's put in effect. He's transferred to Canada. That's a system that exists for a number of offenders. Starts serving his sentence here and almost immediately repudiates his plea, basically saying, you know what, I had no intention to plead guilty. I only did it because I was tortured, things along those lines. And of course, he then launches an appeal saying at least one of the criminal offenses for which he was convicted of is no longer a crime. There's been a change in the U.S. law. He wants it all unraveled.
So he was granted this plea deal, and in accordance with the plea deal were a number of conditions, including moving back to Canada. And now he's going to argue that the system that was put in place that granted him this plea deal and all of these conditions that followed is bogus? Like, how is it that he is able to even make this legal argument?
Well, there is a bit of picking and choosing here. I mean, to be fair, I think he is taking some elements of the U.S. plea deal and saying, I'm comfortable with those because obviously he succeeded in getting a transfer from a U.S. detention center to a Canadian one. But his main concern is in saying, look, I pled guilty to something that the Supreme Court of the United States now says is not an offense, and I only pled guilty because I was being mistreated, because basically the U.S. justice system was perverse. Right. So now I'm going to try to unravel all that. And while I do it, I want to be out on bail here in Canada.
Well, of course. Now, I do have a sort of, just to broaden this very quickly, there are Canadians that are convicted in U.S. prisons and that are granted, in accordance with various plea deals, a condition to come back to Canada. And if all of a sudden those conditions are in question, what does that mean for U.S.-Canada relations?
Well, this is exactly one of the reasons, perhaps the primary reason, why the federal government is so upset by the decision as it stands now, and why they're taking the extraordinary step of an emergency motion and application. From a diplomatic perspective, it's disastrous to say that from Canada's end, we can't control our judiciary, and obviously we shouldn't, in my view, be controlling judiciary, but the judiciary are sort of running amok, is the view in America, saying that they're going to release an individual who had this deal, who was serving a sentence in Canada, and what does that mean to other people who in the future seek to have their sentences transferred over? From a jurisdictional perspective as a lawyer, it's really a complicated Pandora's box. Mm-hmm. The idea that you can take a sentence in the U.S., agree to all of those terms, allow the appeal period to be exhausted, which is always the standard process, then come to Canada, start your sentence, and then try to unravel all of it is very, very problematic. So the government is seeking to break down all that on jurisdictional grounds. Their argument tomorrow is going to be, look, there is no jurisdiction to impact a U.S. sentence. We as Canada, we're just the custodians holding the key. Mm-hmm. This is an American jail sentence. He's serving it here. Don't ask us to upend that. We're not going to touch it.
So they're seeking what's known as a stay in proceedings, which will prohibit his ultimate bail or his ultimate release. The likelihood of success in this, what is that?
I actually think it's reasonably good at this point. Now, I want to clarify what I mean by that. The government, I think, has a reasonably good chance of staying the current decision that says that Omar Khadr should be released as early as tomorrow. Because of the jurisdictional issues with that decision, because of its extraordinary impact, and I think its legally dubious foundation, the government may well get the Court of Appeal to say, you know what, until we hear further arguments on this, we're not going to allow a lower court provincial judge to basically upend a deal that was put in place and tear apart the fabric of Canada-U.S. relations on these types of sentences. Now, remember, though, all of that doesn't mean that Omar Khadr is going to be serving the rest of his life in a Canadian jail. For so many people mention that. He's getting released one way or the other in 2018. That's when his sentence expires. He's eligible for a parole application in accordance with all of the rules. He doesn't have to appeal anything for that as early as this June. Mm-hmm. So at some point, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's June this summer, or whether it's 2018, but at some point in the next 3 years or so, Omar Khadr is going to be released. released, he is going to be living in Canada.
This is a man who is unrepentant, who has said one of the best moments of his life was murdering U.S. medic Christopher Speer. So I do not understand why, in my opinion, he continues to pose a threat to the United States. Maybe he doesn't create a bomb and blow up the CN Tower, but indefinitely, I suspect he will be a man that's perhaps vocal online, sympathetic to various ISIS causes. Does that not factor into any of these decisions?
Well, it could, but the government's made some interesting and maybe difficult choices that people would be critical of. The analysis of whether or not he forms a risk is something the government never undertook. In other words, in this application, there was no claim by the federal government that he was a risk. There was no claim that he couldn't be properly supervised on bail. This was purely a jurisdictional argument that, at least at the lower court level, the government lost. So it'll be very difficult for them now to change their minds, go back and re-inject this question of, is Omar Khadr in fact a risk? I think that ship has sailed from a legal perspective.
I do wonder if that will happen. In the event that he is granted bail, what conditions, if any, will be placed on him?
There's all sorts. I mean, it's completely open to the court to craft anything, and that's going to include this bizarre scenario where he'd be residing with his lawyer. His lawyer is going to be his surety, Dennis Edney.
Not Elizabeth May, because I know she's opened the door for that.
She may well have made a better opportunity from my perspective. As a lawyer, there may be plenty of clients who I felt very strongly about and felt very close to. I have never offered any of those people the opportunity for me to act as their surety. If I want to do that, I step back from the role of lawyer and I step into the role of surety. I never let those two things overlap. Mr. Edney's taken a very interesting and, in my view, dangerous approach to merge those two. So that's what he's looking at now. But if he's released, if Omar Khadr's released, it can include conditions about where he's going to live, how he can access computers, who he can talk to, electronic monitoring, so an ankle bracelet, for example. I mean, the panoply of options available to the court are huge, and that's what we expect to hear tomorrow only if the federal government loses its attempt to block this application in the first place.
And come 2018, will all of those restrictions be lifted?
Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, once the sentence is done, if he gets paroled early, there can be conditions as part of the parole. But at the end of the sentence in 2018, there's nothing to prevent whatever activities, lawful ones, Omar Khadr wants to be involved in. Now, of course, we would expect that security forces would be keeping a very close eye on him. They may try to seek a peace bond, for example, or if he steps offline even an inch, they're going to be right back in there laying new charges, but he won't be able to be monitored or supervised or controlled by virtue of the old charges once the sentence is done and expired.
But all of this is to say that you think that the federal government will be successful in preventing his ultimate release on bail?
If I were a betting man, I think this jurisdictional argument that the government has is in fact a good one. It's not the one that I think most lay people wanted to hear argued, but it's probably the winner, at least at this point, that will stall Omar Khadr's release but not indefinitely stop it.
All right, Ed. Thanks very much.
My pleasure.